So we have to get rid of this for all the people who are watching the screen. Not to show all those thousands of people. We don't want them to have this in the way. It's a Zok Tehillim of the Gemara. Rabbi Huda, the fourth line from the top on bottom of Aleph. Ad Shehei Sham Zokan Talmud. If you know at one time a kever was placed in this field, you have to always be machmer not to walk through that field. Assume there's a tumas oil there, unless Acheshem Zakan Talmud, who has clear records, who can tell us without a doubt that for sure he knows that there was a harisha done there, which would have dismembered everything. Not everybody's a buck. So Vosab is the Talmid Chachamim will know. Amar Abaye Shemami, you see from here a very important rule. That's Tzuva Marabonam, the Ika B'Masa, a Talmid Chacham that's in the city, called Mili de Masa Leiramya. He has to take responsibility for things. A Rav can't say, or a Talmid Chacham will say, it's not my business. No, Tzuva Marabonam has to take responsibility. He has to know who's buried where. He has to know the politic. If by mistake someone plowed, and therefore now it would be mutter, he needs to know what's going on. Talmid Chacham can't recuse himself from things that are going on in the city. We rely on him to clarify things. Rabbi Yehuda, what happens? Motza Evan Mitzuyenis. You find a stone that has sid on it. So let's see with Rashi has something interesting to say. A lot of people claim that Rashi in Moed Katan isn't really Rashi. The real Rashi on Moed Katan is the Rashi on the Rif. So let's see what and Rashi says things in Moed Katan that aren't typical of what Rashi normally says. So let's see this Rashi. So they smeared white sid over it. So clearly this rock is indicating a kever. Right below this rock is tamei. And from my zayda, so this is not something typically that Rashi would say, but as Eidiklach might have said this. You don't have to, if the Evan is what's indicating that there's a kever below here, you wouldn't have to mark it. We learned earlier you have to mark it a little bit away. So by the time you discover the marking, you're not already tummy. Why don't you have to? The stone is not flush with the ground; it sticks out, and therefore you'll see it before you touch it. That's why it's good to have a big stone. Where's the kiva? It's good to have a big stone. Why? Because that can be seen from the distance, and you're not going to discover it when you're already on it. If you just have a marking on the ground, you might not notice it until you're already upon it. If it's just on a flat field, the tzion has to be before you hit the grave, but very close to it, not too far away, as we learned, because you don't want to lose square footage of Eretz Yisrael. Because sometimes you don't see it until it's too late. So Zok Tehillim de Gemara. If you saw one stone that was mitziyanis, tachtei tome, you assume that right underneath it it's tome. So there's a little bit of grade about this. Either it's a bigger stone, or Rachman Litzlan, we assume that a child died. Shtayim, what if there's two stones? Rashi's Mitziyanis. So then Sid Beinein, if not only are the rocks themselves marked, but the land in between the rocks are marked, then we say Beinein Tamid. Then we say that the two rocks, one marked one end of the grave, and one marked the other end. Rashi says Tachtei on Tamid, Aval Beinein. Because that means it's part of the tziyah. Rashi mentioned. No, I thought Mishum Tzion, who is the sid that's in between the two stones, must also be indicating that there's a kever underneath it. The reason why they put the sid not only on the rocks, but in between the rocks, is to indicate that in between the rocks is also a kever. The in ain't sid beinehen, but if there's no sid in between the rocks, then beinehen tar, and we'll say it's two independent graves. The afal gav the lekach chayrish, even though there's no indication that anyone plowed there. There's a Rashi shalecharish b'nei me'olam. It's still tar kileka sid because we'll assume it's two small graves. fact, the Gemara Batanya, we have a brisa that says, Motza Evan Achas Mitzuyenes, if you find one stone marked Tachta Atame, Shtayim, Im Yesh Charish Beinehen Tar, Bimla Beinehen Tame. We just said that unless there's sid in between the rocks, it's going to be tar. This brisa says, as long as there's no charisha, we automatically assume that tame, even without sid. So Rashi, Ein Charish Beinehen Tame, I forgot the lekasid. Why? We should sign the savonim shemikan mikan. Since he already marked the stone on either end of the grave, let's sign beinehen. He didn't see a need to mark in between. It should be self-understood that in between there's a toma there, unless you see a charisha. Amra Papa, Hacha kishashid shafuch al reishein umuruda lekanu lekan. You could see that when they put the sit on, they didn't just pour directly on the rock. You see it's flowing over from the rock onto either side. That's already a different signal. Dr. Rashi, Hacha de Katani Kileka Charish Tame is going to Shafach al Rashi Avanim, but it's also flowing over, I mean, it's not wet now, but you can see it also poured over and extended to Lakanu Lakan Beinayim. The Ike Charish, then you'll say as follows. If there's Charisha, only then will you say it's tar in between, and we'll say Machmas Charishu, the Iklaf, Sheniklaf Mnavanim, V'naflu Sham Beinayim, V'tar. You'll say that the reason why, so there's actually sid in between the two graves, but it's clear from the sid that it just overflowed from the rock when they poured the sid on the rock. Now, if there's charisha there, then you might assume that maybe you never purposely poured the sid on the land in between the two rocks, but it was on the side of the rocks. But when you're plowing through the rocks, in between the rocks, you're going to bang your plow and your equipment into the rocks. You're going to break off some of that sid, and that's why it falls on the floor in between them. But not necessarily to mark a grave. Rather, the grave was only under the rocks, but by you working in between the rocks, you knocked off some sid, and now it fell on the floor. So it looks like the floor is marked. But the Eloi, but if there was no charisha in between, meaning nothing was tampered with, so if you find sid in between the rocks, clearly that was placed there to indicate that there's a mace there. The Eloi, sid the beni benihu, it must be sid that was purposely placed in between the rocks. It must have been placed there to show us that there's a tumas mace there. Not only is there tuma beneath the rocks, but there's also tuma in between the rocks.
Yosy.
I'm sorry?
Yosy. Just in general, I like if wherever the Sion is, like where are we, like what's the distance that we're measuring of where, where the kever is? Like the Sion's on one side. Yeah. So what if there's no demarcation, then what are we saying? What's tuma? Like how far?
If it's a rock, we say only what's directly below the rock. And if it's marked, it would have to be marked with four perimeters around where the mace was, and it's not right over the mace. It's far enough in front of the mace that you'll see the marking on the ground before you're stepped on the mace. So I don't have a measurement in inches or in feet, but you want to keep it as close as possible with just enough distance so that you'll see that before you proceed.
Okay.
That's what people shouldn't step on. That's not so smith. Yeah, same way. But the outlines around the grave that we have is three-dimensional. That could be right over the grave because you'll see it from a distance. See that just paint on the floor, they would usually put a little bit further away so that you'll have a chance to see it. Okay, so Gemara. So b'nei tar. Why? The Aimer Machmus should the Ikbal. You'll say the reason why they sit there on the floor is only because you knocked it off the rock. And if not, then Sid the Beni who that was intentionally placed there, the Tame, and they'll be Tame. Amr Rabasi said, Meitzar Echad Mitsuyin, what if there's a field, but you don't have all four sides of the perimeter marked, you only have one side of the perimeter marked. So then you'll say, Hu Tame, there's a Tuma right beside the Meitzar, but the whole field, we don't have to assume there's Tuma inside it, there's probably Tuma right near the marking. I'm not sure how that works, because if there's like one line, so on what side of the line is the Tuma? It must mean that the Sid marking was thick enough that right underneath it, there could be a body, I guess. Shnayim, if you have two sides of the perimeter marked, once again, Haim Tmein, V'chol Asada Kula Tahira. Shloisha, even if you have three sides of the perimeter marked, Haim Tmein, V'chol Asada Kula Tahira. But Arba, if you have four marked, then Haim Tahira, then the actual perimeter that's marked is actually Tahar, because we're assuming that the marking is not like in the earlier three cases, where the marking indicates a tumah beneath the marking. Rather, this type of marking, where it's around the perimeter of a field and it surrounds the field, indicates that within the field is a tumah. So therefore, hein tahayin, chol hasada kula tmeya, but there must be mason spread throughout this entire field, or it might be a place where it's avad bakever, and therefore this entire parcel of land is off limits. Damar mar, ein marchikin siyai mimakom tumah shel hafsadas Eretz Yisrael. You're not supposed to be marchik the scene from makom tumah. So if you have the whole perimeter marked, it must be that it's full of makom tumah. Zokt Rashi, ein marchikin siyai mimakom tumah ulahaki tain kol arba mitzvah. That's why whoever did the marking marked all four sides of the perimeter. That they kol hasada nitma, must be that the whole field is tumah. You wouldn't have been able to have only one marking on one side of the field to indicate tumah in the entire field, because the ein brachik in Sion mimakam tumah. You're never allowed to have a team far away from the makam tumah. It has to be right there, so it can't be indicated in the whole area, unless, of course, you've surrounded a field and you marked out the entire perimeter. That clearly indicates that the whole field is tumah. Zok the Helu the Gemara weiter the yoytin afalaklai. They also send out shluchim to check to see if there's klein there, and if there is, they have to take action, and we'll see what action is taken. Zok to Gemara, v'aklayim b'chaylo shel Moed nafkinan. Are you telling me that they don't go out until halfway through Nisan to check on the klayim? Or a mini, we have a brisa that says the echad ba'adar, on the first day of Adar, mashmin al shkolim. That's when they start announcing that the shkolim have to be assembled, klayim, and for klayim. So you see that it already happens be'echad ba'adar. I'm sorry, that's just the mashmin. B'chamisha asaboy, Kurnis HaMegillah, they read the Megillah, the Krachim in the larger cities, the Yotzin Lakavitz is Adrachim, and they go to dethorn the roads to pull the obstacles off the road. Ulasakin Erechoivos, the Lomer HaMekvois, to measure the Mekvois, the Oisin Kol Tzorchei Rabim, Umitzayin is a Kfaris, and they mark the Kfaris, and the Yotzin Alaklayim. So you see here that a month earlier, already in Adar, the Shluchim go out to stop Klein from growing, and we'll see exactly what it is that they do. Let's see Rashi. So everyone should bring their shkolim on time for Nisan. Which it says in the parsha that we just learned in Ve'era. It says Chadesh v'aveli midarshan Chadesh v'aveli karbon mitruma chadash. Bring me the karbanos from Rosh Chodesh Nisan and on from the new collection. So you have to start getting the money together in Chodesh Adar. The Krachim, Hamukafin Schoima, Hamukafin Chamim Moshuvanim, that's when you lay on day 15. There's Mikvois Hamayim, Mikvois Hamam Shal Memsa, the Mikvois of Memsa that people tell Shechoiti the Noisan and Azevel Shenichnas L'Soichan Kol Yemoishak Shama. You can dig them out. If mud and rocks and all other types of refuse got into them, which made them smaller, you're allowed to dig them out. Frek the Gemara, Frek Rashi, we asked the stira about the fact that the Brisa mentions that they go out for Klayim earlier, they go out in Adar. So why does our Mishnah say they go out on Nisan? But there's many other things as well in this Brisa that are contradictory. Frek Rashi, Haidle Parach Nami B'Gemara, Ashar Mas Nisan, and this once again is not typical of Rashi to ask a kasha that Tosfos would ask. So that's why people say that this Rashi here is Talmidei Rashi. V'haidle Parach Nami B'Gemara, Ashar Mas Nisan, the Tani Umasakin Tadrochim V'Rechoivos B'Chayil Shel Moed V'Hachatana B'Tesva B'Adar. The same way we're asking the stira about going out for Klayim, why couldn't we ask the same stira about the other functions that are done, which the Brisa says in Adar and our Mishnah says in Nisan? And that's what Rashi Mishum B'La Pirchu. That's not a kasha. You know why? The Bedinu, the Masakin will trace him. they may go fix it twice. The chimisakin the test of other, even if they fix everything over in test of other, the winter is not completely over, and there can still be additional problems that come up that have to be corrected in this one. Also, Geshamim umakal kiluhu, the hadju masakin luhu, the chaylo shomayim. Aval aklayim by klayim, even the akrulahu legamri b'chamisha also other, if they were oiker, if they uprooted and they pulled out the klayim on the 15th day of Adar, there's nothing left. It's not like damage that could reoccur in a mikveh. Here, you pulled out the klayim, there's nothing left, and that's why the Gemara is asking the question. Zok to Gemara, Rabbi Lozer, Rabbi Yosy bar Chanina. We have two terutzim to the stira why there's two visits for klayim in Adar and Nisan. Chadam or kan bebechir, kan ba'afel. There are certain plants that grow earlier and there are certain plants that grow later. So therefore, they went out of Adar to deal with the klayim that might have grown earlier, and they went out of Nisan to deal with the klayim that might have grown later. Rashi says, I'm sorry? Why?
Because, of course, you go out twice. Just like the boys can get you in.
Right, but the Gemara didn't ask them because I guess it was more obvious to the Gemara that would happen. But it wasn't so obvious to the Gemara at first that there'd be earlier klayim and later klayim. Or the Gemara maybe would have thought that, so wait till later and do everything all together. And that the Gemara says, no, as the klayim grows, we want to jump on it right away. Maybe that's what the Gemara says.
There's one just a quick side note. Kind of everything's good. A lot of the stuff has to do with
I don't think so.
just down. You don't want to do.
Yeah. We don't want them to be nichshel in the very plant to even let it grow. The Chad Amar, I don't know if klayim is also bechila. You just not to let it grow. But we eat klayim, right? There's a lot of fruit that we eat that are klayim. Tastes very good. Zaks Gemara, the Chad Amar kan b'zroyim kan b'yerakas, which is the same idea. Rashi says zroyim ala tfua, klayim that might have grown amongst tfua yoytzim b'tesva ba'ader. Why? Shekodim l'yerakas. They already grow earlier than the vegetables, but the yerakas grow later, so that's why they go out twice. Amar Basi, Amar Bechim. Lo shanu elo she'ein nitza nikar. The only time we say then yoytzim alayim, Rashi says kodim ader the kodim chaylo shamoid, that we say that you go out at these times and you don't have to go out earlier, that's only if you can't see them blossoming. Aval nitzan nikir, if you could tell that the klayim is blossoming earlier, yoytzin alein, you'd have to go and prevent that from growing as well. The Brisa and the Mishnah are referring to what's typical. What typical is you don't see any sign of blossoming, so therefore you don't know that klayim is growing there. But in fact, if you did see klayim growing there, of course, you would have to protest that. You can't go right before Yom Tov, right after Yom Tov. It has to be the dafka on Yom Tov. Zok to Gemara, Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yechanan, Mishum Schar Pu'ula the Musligaban. On Chalamoid, labor is cheap. Why? Everybody's out of work because the Jews have all their businesses closed on Chalamoid. So there's many people that are out of work. If there's people that are out of work, you can hire people for much less. Zok Rashi, Mishum Schar Pu'ula the Musligaban, Kloimer Sheyachal Liska Pralim Bezoil. That's when you can get cheap labor. Since they're not working on Chalamoid, you can find people who will work for less. Rabbi Zvid said, from the fact that we're looking to save money, it tells us very clearly that who's paying for these shluchim? Is it billed back to the owners of the field whose fields were found with kloyim, or is it paid for by the municipality? Is it paid for by the Trumas Alishka? So it must be that it's paid for by the Trumas Alishka. If the people were billed for the services offered by these shluchim, my nafkalon minayu. Why would we care to save money to the people? Whatever they want, you can give them. Whatever you want, you can give them. So this sounds like a liberal government. When we're paying our employees, oh no, we don't want you to be unionized. Oh, but everybody else should be unionized.
That's so against what we usually say. We're always worried about Hesed Mammon with halacha.
Right, but it's not Hesed Mammon you'll pay fair labor rates. No one's
No,
suggesting.
it is hefsid. If you're paying more, then it's a
Yeah.
hefsid, no?
It's not a hefset to pay normal labor rates, but for tzarech hektish, for tzarech harabim, you're allowed to use labor that will be offered for cheaper.
Line was an issue. If you're
That's right.
sending out two
That's right.
Right, so, I mean, you use a lot of argument to say that you bill it back to the field owner.
Yeah,
You're
because
causing a loss to the.
No, economic.
municipality.
and economic. But what we're saying is so let the homeowner also let the field also benefit from cheap labor. And that the unions would have freaked out had they tried that. Zok the Heilige Rashi, the Sogdadach with the two, the Balabayis Yoivlu, and my Yoichin Lachi Bechelo Shamoy. Why would we allow people to do some Holomoid? Mishum Scharpula. Levatle Becholzman, they can go anytime. Avagav the Lekas Scharpsula Bazul, even though you don't have cheap labor any other time besides Holomoid. Whatever the cost is for normal labor, you give him. Ella must be mitrumas alishka yavina lahu, and therefore v'chokama de matina letamtem moyes the hektish avdina. You have to be very frugal when it comes to moyes hektish. When it comes to regular money, you're not allowed to be wasteful, but you don't have to be super cheap. You're allowed to pay normal labor rates. Correct, precisely. The at kama, zokt Rashi. What does at kama mean? But kama of a climb the chayv levatli. If there's one little plant growing and it's a huge field, there you wouldn't have to be the vatal the climb. So how high of a ratio of climb of the foreign plant must be there to mandate that you have to be mavatalit? Zok to Gemara, Amar Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Ka'oshish Sheminu, like we learned in the Brisa. Kol saw sheyesh baroiva, any saw that has in it a roiva akav of zera of growth mimin acher from a different species yemayit. You just have to reduce it to amount that's less than the threshold. So what exactly is the ratio of the threshold? So the top Rashi says roiva akav, a quarter of a kav is echad michav dalad b'sa. It's 1/24 of a saw. So if in fact there's too much climb, then all you have to do is reduce it to below the threshold. You don't have to destroy all the climb, just reduce it to below the threshold, so then it won't be a problem. Shimzara roiva kav, if there was a roiva kav of foreign material, yimaitenu v'yakrenu, you should reduce it by uprooting it. Frank to Gemara, how could you say you just need to bring it below the threshold? They made a takana that they're not mamayit. The shluchim don't just pull out some to bring it to below the threshold. We actually learned that they're mafkir the whole field. They're mafkir the whole field. At first, they weren't mafkir your whole field if they found climb in your field. Rather, this is what they used to do. The Tanya, the shluchim would come around. They would inspect your field, and if they saw that there's more than the allowed ratio of climb, they would pull out enough of the climb to reduce it below the threshold, just like we learned at the top of the Amid. And those foreign plants, they would throw it in front of the behemoths that were in that field that belonged to the owner, which is literally a free service. The Balabatim were very happy. They had no incentive whatsoever to stop climb from growing in their fields because it was a win-win. It didn't cost them a penny. You had free labor who came and pulled the weeds out of your field because they don't want the climb to grow. They're like weeds. They're ruining their main plant. So I get a guy who's doing for free, pulling my weeds. That's a achas shemenach shinohem. So they're saying you're pulling the weeds out. The achas, and the secondary benefit I have is shemashlichin lefnei behem, and you're feeding my behemoths. So I love climb because it gets me free labor. That wasn't good because we really don't want the shluchei bezdin to have to do this. We want every person to take responsibility for his own field. So they had to de-incentivize people to leave climb growing. So then they did a takana heskinu shiu oikrin umashlichin al adrach. Then they uprooted the climb and they didn't give it to the behemoths, which would benefit the homeowner. They threw them out. So that's already less of an incentive, but it was still a good incentive. So they're saying they still got a free labor to pull the weeds out of their fields. So therefore, they had to eliminate any incentive. And what they did was, whenever they found climb growing in the field, they were mafkir the whole field. Now the balabais doesn't want to lose his field, so he's going to quickly pull out all of the weeds. So there's a shaila. If your field is hefker, can you then go and be zoichen it? Sure, anybody else can be zoichen it, but can you be zoichen? So the answer is yes. But the problem is it's still going to be hefker, and until you pull the weeds out, your shad will be hefker. But you can quickly grab it, quickly pull the weeds out, and then you're safe. But if somebody else grabs it and pulls the weeds out, then he gets to keep it. So therefore, it created a tremendous incentive for people to keep their weeds down. Now the question is,
just wanted to clarify, is there a time limit on the first?
you're not even allowed to use pesticides anymore. How are you supposed to do that? What, Davi?
There's a time limit on the hefkeris, on the hefkeris of the field.
There's no time limit. As soon as you're caught with Clyde and your field is hefker, and if anybody gets there before you to pull the weeds out,
I'm saying it's only hefker until you pull it out.
Correct. No, I think that's to be growth. Has to be growth. Yeah. If you quickly uproot it before there's growth, I don't think there's an issue.
They inspect it again, or like you just like how do you know it's when it's not hefker?
Well, that's a very good question because there's a lot of talk in the Mefarshim. Do they have to formally be mafker it, or if I'm walking by someone else's field and I see climb, can I say, oh, it's hefker and seize it? Is it automatically hefker, or does an inspector have to declare it as hefker? So there are shittas to learn that it's automatically hefker, which means people are very much diligent and vigilant to take care of their fields, because anybody who catches them, and I'm sure there's always a nudnik there waiting for the gotcha moment, so that he can take your field away, and therefore people were very, very careful not to let climb grow. So that's why they made that the claim. But there are those who have to be declared.
They can actually take the field away, like as I'm saying, like
Yes,
it just
you can actually take the field away. Yeah, they can repossess the field. No, the field itself. That someone can actually take your field away. If you let climb grow and someone comes and he cutting your field and you're stuck, you have to hope. You have to hope that he'll also not pull the weeds, and then you can get it back.
This is where he planted the doctor plant.
No, even if it grew, yeah, we know that because he's happy that people are pulling weeds out. So obviously it's something that he didn't even want.
So wait a minute, he can kind of like he's kind of field that's climb. I mean, I don't like he has to pull it out. And he's kind of
you walk down the street and you see a field that's growing climb. You can just pull in and say it's my field now. And when the owner comes and say, "What are you doing here?" They'll say, "What am I doing here? What are you doing here?" It probably didn't happen. Once they made that rule, I'm sure people, it's like when you get a notice from the city that if you don't cut your grass, they're going to charge you $50,000 to cut your grass. You cut your grass, you cut it quickly, right? Zog to more about you. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov says, Moishchin es hamayim me'ilan le'ilan. So we already had this, we already had this Mishnah quoted. You're allowed to be moishech water from ilan to ilan. Now, there's a little bit of a discrepancy between how Rashi explains it here on the Mishnah and how we learned it already earlier from Rashi. So I want to go back to, I believe it's Dalet Amud Beis. I'm sorry, it was Amud Aleph. It was an Amud Aleph. It was when we were looking for a Tana of the Mishnah. We were looking for a Tana of the Mishnah who holds that Tircha Yisera is Osfer. So it was right over here. So it says on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, if I'm in the right place, we were looking for a Tana. It's Beis Amud Aleph. Oh, it's Beis Amud Aleph. Oh.
There's the last two.
Beis Amud Aleph. So we look. Good old Messiah Shas. Yes, I should. Yes, right away on the first Amud. Yes. The produce becomes hefker? Oh, so all of the produce in the field, not the land itself. Oh, okay. So Dr. Golda is correcting me when it says, and Duvi was really concerned about this. When it says Shimafkir and Kala Sadakula, it doesn't mean the actual land, it means everything that's growing in the field. So anybody can go in and cut anything they want down from the field, but they can't actually possess the field. Okay, I stand corrected. Who does he quote that from? Because Rashi doesn't say it, the very sure. Okay. Okay, very good. Chazanish probably has a right. I just don't know what it is. Okay, so let's see how Rashi on Daf Beis Amud Aleph teaches the mission that we're learning. So I'm 3 lines up from the wide lines in Daf Beis Amud Aleph. It says, "Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer Moshchin Samayim Ilan Ilan Ubilvad Shelo Yashke Es Hasada." So Rashi says, "Mashkin Samayim Ilan Ilan V'Chaylo Shamayim," and Rashi explains, "In Yeshmayim Tachas Ilan Echad, if there's water underneath one tree, Oisin Derech Katan Me'ilan Ilan, you're allowed to make a little trench to allow the water to go to a different tree, so that the water should also treat the next tree. So right off the bat, Rashi is saying this is considered a beis habal, and therefore you're not allowed to do any improvement, even if there's no tircha, because that's the harvacha. It's harvacha, and you're not allowed to do any tircha for harvacha. So why are you allowed to go mi'ilan mi'ilan? It must be Rashi knows that that's so benign, that's so simple, that's not even a tircha, that's nothing. So from one field to another field, you're allowed to do the harvacha, but you can't do even the slightest tircha la harvacha. So therefore, la yashkes asadakula. Alma darvacha, the milsa asher abelasu. You see, abelasu asher harvacha if there's a slight tircha. So that's how Rashi learns on Daf Beis Amud Aleph that there's no tircha here whatsoever mi'ilan, but there is a tircha if you go l'chala sadukula. Rashi over here, I believe, says a little different. Let's see what Rashi says over here. Moichid amayim mi'ilan, the havik kasada beis hashlochen. Legabi that, it believes like a sada beis hashlochen, the pseidi yiseri. So what Rashi is saying is that even though normally it's a beis habal field, but when it comes to bringing water to a tree, the tree itself needs water. The tree has a din of a beis hashlochen, that's a pseida. That's clearly a departure from the way Rashi explained this very same Mishnah on that Beis Amud Aleph. Avalo yashkes asada kula, sada beis because it's sada beis habal. Right. So on the second half of the Mishnah, Rashi is consistent with what he said earlier. You can't be mashke the whole sada because it's the beis habal. But while you're allowed to go from tree to tree, Rashi on the Beis Amud Aleph seems to say it's not a tirch at all, and Rashi over here says it's because the tree itself is considered like a beis hashloch. Let's have a look again. So let's see what Rashi says again on the Mishnah. Rashi says, the harvacha. That's on the second half. So you're saying on the first half, maybe it's not because it's not a tirch at all. Maybe because okay, could be. That's not how the oil learns in Rashi over there. But I hear you can argue that, and Rashi didn't say it like Rashi says it over here because I guess it wasn't directly relevant. Okay. Well, that's right. That's the point that we're talking about. There's some inconsistency. Okay, weiter. Zok the Mishnah weiter. Zroyim shalei sasu l'fnei moed. If you have seeds that you planted but you didn't water them, then lo yashkim b'moed. You're not allowed to water them on moed because they won't suffer a loss. The chachamim atirim b'zeh b'zeh. The chum allow everything. Let's see Rashi. Zroyim shalei sasu l'fnei moed. Shaloi hayu mulumodim lishtois tamid l'fnei moed. You never water them. Since you didn't water them regularly before the moed, there will be no loss. But the Charmatir was that. You're allowed to do anything. Why? Because they hold you're allowed to do things even la harvacha. Who is that consistent with? That's That's what the Chacham means. Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, Im haisa sada mitunenes. If it was a field that is mitunenes, then it will be mutar. What is a sada mitunenes? Rashi says, Hadam Arbelazar, Avalo Yashkus Sada Pula. That's only if it's not a sada mitunenes. Avalam haisa sada mitunenes, which means lacha b'yavesha. It was originally moist and it dried out. Then mutar lashkoisa. Then you're allowed to irrigate it. Aval gab davasada beisabal. Even though it's a field that normally has enough water, even the havelaycha adata at hashta, since it was moist until now, and now it dried up, ilay mashkala have a pseidi yasera. If you're not going to irrigate it, it'll lead to a large loss. Tani namihachi kishamur oshkol ashkoshim b'moed loy amru el bezroim shaloi shasul ufnei moed. That's only seeds that were not watered before moed. Al bezroim shasul ufnei moed muter lashkoshim b'moed. Those seeds you're allowed to irrigate even on chalamoid because they will become a loss. The moed shasadim mitunenes muter again because that will lead to a loss. The ein mashkin sada gorid b'moed. A sada gorid or grid, you're not allowed to be mashkin b'moed. And Rashi says yeveshim ha'olim is always dry. That does not need to be watered. That will not suffer damage. Therefore, you're not allowed to water it. The Chachamim Matirin, once again, you're a mayor who holds you're allowed to water things even like Harvacha, Matirin Bazo Bazeh, as Rashi says, beside the grid, it was Rashi Shalachos Lemon. Rabbi, Shemamina, you see from here, High Tarbitza. Our Tarbitza is a personal garden. Shari Litarbutze V'choylo D'mayada. You're allowed to water it slightly. Rashi says, L'zalef Allah Mai. You're allowed to water it slightly, even though there will be no loss. So Rashi seems to say that you're allowed to give it water leharvacha on chalosh hamoed. So this must be following the shita of Reb Meir, because we know we don't allow anything leharvacha. Tosfos has a huge problem with this. Why would Ravina paskin halacha l'maisa not like what we paskin? Not like Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, who we paskin like, who holds that wouldn't be allowed. So Tosfos has a different shot. But Rashi learns that Ravina seems to be consistent with Reb Meir that allows you to water things even though it will not cause damage. So the grid, my timer, why are you allowed to water a soda grid? Because the afla, no, Ravina is saying you are allowed to. Let's see Rashi. It's just a slight irrigation. So the vegetables should grow. So Rashi is now telling us that the word hashka means a full irrigation, and the word tarbutza means just a little bit of a sprinkling. So sada grid, my timer, everybody holds a sada grid. A sada grid you're not allowed to. My timer, the afla mash v'lucharfa, hachanami afla mash v'lucharfa. Afla l'shavi charfa, the lekab seda, v'afilu hachi shari lashkoisa, kach ulashmicha, hachanami begin. I'm sorry, I'm making a mistake. The Ravina is saying, how do I know that you're allowed to sprinkle water on the garden? Because it should be no different than a sada grid, which the Chachamim also allow you to water. Sada grid, my time, why are you allowed to do it? The afla mashlu charfa. What it's doing is it's causing the fruits to grow more quickly. Something that would have normally grown later, it's causing it to grow earlier, which is leharvacha. Hachanami, when you're sprinkling water on your garden, afla mashlu charfa, it makes your vegetables grow a little bit faster. So it's leharvacha, and Reb Meir or the Chachamim allow harvacha. Tana Rabbanan, marbitin steilovan b'shvius. You're allowed to water a steilovan on the Shemitah year, avoloi b'moed, but not on Chol HaMoed. For the Gemara about Tanya, we learned in our Mishnah, marbitin bein b'moed bein b'shvius. You're allowed to water a steilovan, which is considered a base of shloch. I'm sorry, it's a base of al. We learned you're allowed to do it bein b'moed bein b'shvius, which again, of course, is not going according to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. It's have to be going according to Meir. We can say that the bride who doesn't allow it on Moed is going according to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, who doesn't allow you a tircha for harvacha in a southern base of al. And the bride who says you're allowed to water it, the Moed is going according to the Chachamim. But the Tani bein b'moed bein b'shvius, Hani Chachamim, which is our Meir, the material hashkus afilu kol hasada. Tani the chilum to another brayso. Marbitin stay love on Arab shvius. You're allowed to water stay love on Arab shvius. So to prompt the growth of the vegetables, to make the vegetables grow on Shemitah year. Not only that, so they love them you're even allowed to water a field on Shvius to make the vegetables grow after Shvius. So either the action that you're doing before the Shemitah year makes it allowable, or the result that occurs after Shemitah makes it allowable. What would not be allowed to Rashi, what's not allowed is to irrigate on Shvius to prompt the growth of pears and Shvius. That would not be allowed. Zok the Gemara weiter. If you have pests and vermin that are eating your crops and destroying your crops, you're allowed to trap them and get rid of them. The Gemara is going to talk about what ishos are. Achborim, we know, are mice. Ubishvius and on Shemitah as well. Even though it's being misak in the field, Rashi says. A steo ilan, you're allowed to do it normally. You don't even have to make a shinoi because it causes a tremendous amount of damage, the Gemara is going to say. But if stay lovin, you don't have to. Rashi says it's hefsek. Remember about stay lovin, which is like a wheat field, only shaloy kedarkei, because it doesn't create as much damage, so therefore you have to do it with a shinoi. If there's a breach in the fence around your field, you're allowed to close it on Chalamoid, and on the Shemitah year, you're allowed to build the wall properly. What are these pests called ishos? Rabbi Yehuda, ber yosh ein lo einayim. It's a creation that has no eyes. And Rashi is the chayver b'karka. And we know from the Playokar, from Arba, that if you cannot see what you're eating, then you're insatiable. So these pests will destroy everything because they're blind. Amar Rabbi Bar Yishmael, I'm sorry? Amar Rabbi Bar Yishmael, Vitema, Rabbi Yemer Bar Shlamya, my Kra, where do you see a puzzle to support this? It says, K'moy Shavlu, Tamas, Yehalech, like a shavlu, which is also some type of insect, a snail, that it itself dissolves. When it leaves its cocoon, it itself dissolves. So too, Neifel Ashes Balchazu Shemesh. So too does this Ashes, which is the insect that never sees the light, that also will fall apart that way. But you see that Ashes are Balchazu Shemesh. This Ashes cannot see. Tanarban. Tadnas Aishos v'sachborin mistei alovan u'mistei ilan kidarkai. And you're allowed to destroy anthols. So now the Gemara is giving us a little bit of a science experiment. What's the best way to destroy an anthol? Maybe offer you take sand from a different anthol and you put it in this anthol. So either just the sand they sense is from the enemy anthol, so they go crazy attacking, or you make sure to take some ants mixed in with the sand. So you're bringing in foreign ants into this one, instead of you exterminating them, create a civil war. Could you imagine if you can get your cockroaches to kill each other out? You'd put every pest control company out of business. Let them kill each other. They don't recognize it, so they go crazy. The only way it's going to be considered foreign earth that's going to cause them to go into a frenzy is the two antholes have to be on two other sides of a river, meaning very far apart, so it's completely unfamiliar. And it has to be where there's no bridge, so the ants could have moved back and forth, because then once again, there is familiarity. Gamla is even a thinner type of bridge. Mitra, there's not even a thin strip going across the river that the ants would be able to. At Kama, at Parsa. How far apart do they have to be in order for this to work? They have to be a Parsa part. So Rashi says, if there's no Parsa in between them, there'll be a familiarity and they won't kill each other. If you want your ants to kill each other, make sure they're not familiar with each other. Okay, gewaltig. Let's stop here. A stay lovin is a field that has wheat growing.